My name is Arthur Coleman. I'm 68 years old, and I was on my way to my son's house holding a gift I'd spent weeks restoring. I thought it was a night for reconciliation, a chance to finally feel like a father again. Then my lawyer texted. He told me to call him immediately. He told me that while I was in my workshop polishing old tools for my son was busy signing my name on a document that would cost me my home, my savings, and my entire life. He told me I was ruined. And the worst part, my son was waiting for me with a smile and a dinner invitation, and he had no idea that I knew. Before I continue this story, please hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The scent of linseed oil and old cherry wood filled my small workshop, a smell I'd always associated with peace. I ran a soft, clean cloth over the restored wooden case one last time, making the grain shine under the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. Inside, nestled in new dark green velvet, was a vintage set of electronic testing tools. A gleaming Weston multimeter, a Heathkit signal generator, all with their heavy Bakelite knobs and satisfying solid weight. They were tools from a time when things were built to last, to be understood, to be repaired. My son David had stared at a set just like it in a pawnshop window when he was 15, his face pressed against the glass. One day, Dad, he'd said, his voice full of a dreamer's ambition, "I'm gonna build things that change the world." I couldn't afford it then, but I never forgot. I'd spent the last month hunting down each piece, cleaning the contacts, recalibrating the needles. This wasn't just a gift. It was a message. It was me saying, I still believe in the boy you were. I placed the finished box on the hall table next to my keys and a framed photo of my late wife Claire. Her smile, even in a dusty photograph, could still make the quiet house feel less empty. It had been 5 years since I'd lost her, 5 years of navigating a world that felt off balance. My only anchor was David. Our relationship had been strained since his mother's passing. He was always chasing a new venture, a new dream, and I was always the safety net he called when he fell. But lately, things felt different. His latest tech startup finally seemed to be gaining traction. He and his wife Jessica had invited me for his 42nd birthday dinner. He'd sounded genuinely happy on the phone. Hope is a stubborn old fool, and it had taken up residence in my chest again. I looked at my reflection in the dark face of the grandfather clock. A little tired maybe, but hopeful. The house was paid for. Life was quiet. As I reached for my jacket, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a name that made my heart skip a beat. Ben Carter. Ben had been Claire's best friend, and he'd become my lawyer and confidant after she was gone. He was a man of emails and scheduled calls. He didn't send texts unless the building was on fire. "Call me immediately." The words were stark shouting in all caps. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. My first thought was David. A car accident. An emergency at the office. My thumb, suddenly clumsy, trembled as I pressed the call button. Ben. "What is it? Is David?" "Okay, Art." "Are you sitting down?" Ben's voice was a stranger's. It was flat, stripped of all warmth, the voice he used when he had to walk a client through a tragedy. "I'm standing in my hallway, about to leave for David's. Ben, just tell me what's happened." I heard the distinct rustle of heavy paper on his end, a sound I knew meant legal documents. "I received a certified letter this afternoon, Art. It's from the Legal Counsel for the Small Business Administration. The SBO. My mind raced. I haven't had a business in 20 years, not since I retired from the electrical union. "I know," Ben said, and the two words landed like stones. "The letter is a formal notice of default on an economic injury disaster loan. The loan was issued for $500,000 18 months ago." The hallway seemed to shrink, the air growing thin. To who, Ben? I don't understand. Ben took a slow, deliberate breath, and in that small pause I felt the world beneath my feet fracture. The loan was issued to a company called Coleman Innovations, LLC. The guarantor, Art, The man whose assets are now legally subject to seizure to cover the debt is you. The grandfather clock began to chime 6, each bong a hammer blow against the sudden ringing silence in my ears. No. Ben, that's impossible. I never signed anything. I would never. They have your signature on the guarantee, Art. A digital signature time-stamped. They have your social security number, your full financial history. Everything they needed to approve it. It's all here. $500,000. The number was a monster. My house, the place Claire and I had built from a fixer-upper into a home, was worth maybe $400,000 on a good day. It was everything I had left. The company Coleman Innovations. Ben's voice was gentle now, as if speaking to a man standing on a ledge. It's registered to a single officer, Art. Your son, David. I had to grip the table to stay upright. The gift box, the one I'd poured so much hope into, seemed to mock me from the polished wood. David's excited voice from a few months ago echoed in my head, a phantom of deceit. Dad, the startup is finally getting traction. We just secured some seed funding. Things are looking up. He'd called it seed funding. He hadn't called it grand larceny. He hadn't called it the theft of his own father's future. He forged my signature. I whispered the words, tasting like poison. It appears so, Ben confirmed. Art, this is serious. Federal loan fraud serious. They're talking asset seizure. Your house, your savings, your retirement. Everything. We need to meet first thing Monday. And Art? He paused, his voice firm. Whatever you do, do not confront him. Go to that dinner. Act like you know nothing. We need to see his next move. We need to let him think he's still in control. I hung up the phone. For a full minute, I didn't move. I just stood there, a ghost in my own hallway. The gift I'd made, the memories, the love, it all felt like a currency he had cashed in long ago. And I was on my way to have dinner with the man who had just sold my life. 20 minutes later, I walked through his front door, a polite, hollow smile cemented on my face. His house was a showroom of success I now knew was funded by my ruin. Sleek leather sofas, a massive smart TV whispering commercials, a wine fridge humming with expensive bottles. Jessica greeted me with a perfumed air kiss near my cheek. Art, so good to see you. David's just opening a bottle of something special he's been dying for you to try. David came over, slinging a casual arm around my shoulder, his touch making my skin crawl. Dad, glad you could make it. How was the drive? His smile was effortless, his eyes clear and bright. There wasn't a shadow of guilt in them. He was a phenomenal actor. I had raised a star. I spent the next hour trapped in a waking nightmare, nodding along to stories of their recent trip to Napa, of a lucrative deal David was on the verge of closing. Every word was a lie, polished and presented for my consumption. He had used my name, my life's work, my good credit as his personal slush fund, and he was sitting across from me pouring a $20 glass of Cabernet, complaining about the price of gas. You know, Dad, he said, leaning in with a conspiratorial grin while Jessica was in the kitchen. We're thinking of upgrading. This house is great, but we're starting to feel a bit cramped. Jessica saw a gorgeous place over in Hawthorne Hills. It's a bit of a stretch, but with the way the new venture is about to take off. He let the sentence hang, an open invitation for me to applaud his ambition. He wasn't just spending my future. He was already planning to spend more. Then Jessica's voice, bright and cheerful, called from the dining room. Dinner's ready, and Art. We put you at the head of the table. You're our guest of honor tonight. Guest of honor. I looked at the gleaming table, the perfectly folded linen napkins, the expensive fragrant food. I looked at my son, the man I had given everything to, his face alight, with a confident, easy smile. He wasn't just a liar. He was a predator. And I, his father, was the kill. I took my seat, unfolded the napkin onto my lap, and felt a strange, chilling calm settle deep in my bones. The sky had fallen, but I was still standing. and now I would be the one to watch and wait for the pieces to land. Ben Carter's office was on the 12th floor of a building downtown, a space that smelled of old leather and the quiet, unyielding authority of the law. The view from his window wasn't of parks or trees, but of the sharp geometric angles of other buildings, a landscape of steel and glass where deals were made and broken. It felt appropriate. I had spent my life building things with my hands. My son had tried to build his life with paper and lies. Now paper and law were all I had left to fight him with. Ben was waiting for me, his desk clear except for a single thick manila folder. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He poured me a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe and gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "Art," he began, his voice low and steady. "I spent the weekend reviewing the SBA's correspondence and the loan documentation they attached. It's worse than I thought." I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, grounding. "How much worse, Ben?" He opened the folder and turned it so I could see the top page. It was a copy of the loan guarantee. My name, Arthur Coleman, was typed neatly, and below it a scrawled digital signature that was a passable imitation of my own. Close enough to pass a cursory check. Far enough to be a forgery. This isn't just a simple default, Art. Because of the amount, and because it's a federal program, this is wire fraud. It's bank fraud. And because you're over 65, it falls under statutes for elder financial abuse. He let the words settle in the quiet room. If convicted, David could face significant prison time. Years, Art, not months. The thought of my son in a prison cell sent a cold, sharp pain through my chest, a pain so intense it almost felt like love. But it wasn't. It was the ghost of it. And me, my house, Ben's expression was grim. "Legally, as the guarantor on record, you are liable for the full $500,000. The SBA has given us a 30-day window to respond to their notice of default. If we can't provide a compelling reason why you shouldn't be held responsible, they will begin formal proceedings to place a lien on your assets and seize them. That means your house, your savings, everything. 30 days. A month." A ticking clock had been placed on my life. I looked at the signature again, that crude copy of my name. He had done this. He had signed me up for ruin without a second thought. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to another man in another room. "How do we fight this?" Ben leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "We don't just fight it. We dismantle it. They think they're dealing with a confused old man. We need to show them they're dealing with a victim of a calculated crime. We need to prove you had no knowledge that your signature was forged and that David acted with criminal intent. We need to build a fortress of evidence around you, Art. And we need to do it fast." He took out a yellow legal pad and a pen that made a satisfying click. "Our first job is to prove you couldn't have made that signature. The loan application was submitted online, time-stamped at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday 18 months ago. Where were you on that day?" I stared at him, my mind a blank fog. 18 months ago, it could have been any day. "Ben, I have no idea." "Think, Art," he urged, his voice gentle but firm. Claire had been gone for a few years by then. "What was your routine? Did you have appointments? Did you keep a calendar?" I closed my eyes, trying to pull a single ordinary day out of the past. Routines, habits, Tuesday. It was just a Tuesday. Then a small detail surfaced. My dental cleaning. I said, my eyes flying open. It's always the first Tuesday of the month. Dr. Jensen's office. I'm always his 2 o'clock. I've had that slot for 15 years. Ben's pen began to move. Good. That's good. We can subpoena the dental office's records. It puts you somewhere else. It's a start. He looked at me, his expression serious. Now we need to prove intent on his part. We need to show a pattern. Did he ever ask you to co-sign for anything before? Never, I said. He knew I wouldn't. Not for his ventures. I helped him with his tuition, his first car, the down payment on their first apartment. But I told him after Claire passed that my savings were for my old age. He knew I wouldn't risk the house. But he did, Ben said quietly. He risked it for you. He drew a line on the pad. We need access to his financial records to the shell company's accounts. That will require a subpoena, and for that we need to give the authorities a reason to believe a crime was committed. We need more than just your word against his art. We need paper. We need proof. I thought of the dinner party, the expensive wine, the talk of Napa and Hawthorne Hills, the casual way they spent money that wasn't theirs. A cold resolve began to replace the shock. Ben was right. David had underestimated me. He had counted on my love, my silence, my grief. He had assumed I was a resource he could drain without consequence. He thought I was a confused old man. I said the words tasting like rust. Ben met my gaze. Then let's show him what a clear-minded man with nothing left to lose can do. For the next 2 days, I moved through the house like a ghost. I played the part they had cast for me, the forgetful, aging father. I'd misplace my reading glasses only to find them on top of my head. I'd ask Jessica what day it was twice. She would answer with a patient, condescending smile, exchanging a look with David that said, "See, it's getting worse." They thought my world was shrinking, that my mind was fogging over. They had no idea it had never been clearer. They saw me as a liability. They had no clue I was becoming a detective in my own home. The investigation began with the mail. David had always been careless, assuming I never looked past the bills addressed to me. On Tuesday afternoon, while he was out at a business lunch and Jessica was at a yoga class, I went to the small table in the entryway. Beneath a catalog for a home decor company, I found it. A crisp white envelope with the platinum border of an exclusive credit card company. It was addressed to David, but it was my house, my mailbox. I considered that my permission. I slid it open with the edge of my thumbnail. The statement inside was a roadmap of my ruin. A $5,000 lease payment for a brand new BMW. $7,000 at a Gucci boutique in a city David hadn't even mentioned visiting. Charges from 5-star hotels and restaurants where a single steak cost more than my weekly grocery bill. It was all there in black and white, a life of luxury funded by a lie. I stood there in the silent hallway, the paper trembling in my hand. This wasn't just poor financial management. This was a feast, and I was the main course. I took a photo of every line with my phone, my movements precise and steady, then placed the statement back exactly where I'd found it. My next stop was the garage. I needed a reason to be there, a plausible cover for my search. Looking for the old hedge trimmer, I called out to the empty house, my voice performing for an audience of one. The garage was David's domain, a cluttered mess of his abandoned hobbies and my carefully organized tools. He assumed I never went in there anymore, that the lifting and sorting were beyond me. He was wrong. Behind a stack of his old college textbooks, I found a cardboard box sealed with duct tape. It wasn't labeled. That was the first clue. David labeled everything he wanted found. I sliced the tape with my pocket knife. Inside was not old memorabilia, but a stack of official-looking envelopes. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were from the Small Business Administration. One after another, each one more urgent than the last. Notice of delinquency. Second notice, action required. Final notice, your loan is in default. He hadn't just ignored them. He had hidden them. He knew. For months he had known he was in default, and he had hidden the evidence, all while smiling at me over dinner. Beneath the letters was another folder, this one filled with invoices. At first glance, they looked professional. Receipts for high-capacity server racks, quantum processing units, industrial coolant systems. These were the supposed expenses for his startup, the proof he would have submitted to the SBA to justify the loan. Anyone else would have seen them as legitimate. But they hadn't spent 40 years as a master electrician. My eyes scanned the pages, and my blood ran cold. The details were all wrong. The vendor for the server racks was listed with an address that a quick search on my phone revealed to be a suburban house in a gated community. The part numbers for the processing units were formatted incorrectly, a mix of consumer-grade and nonsensical codes. But the final damning piece of evidence was the power specifications. I ran my finger along one line item, a bill for over $100,000 for a processor. The listed power requirement was 12 amps at 120 volts. I almost laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had just found the crack in a perfect facade. You can't run a world-changing piece of technology on the same amperage it takes to run a coffee maker. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was a complete and utter fabrication. These invoices weren't just inflated. They were fantasies written by a man who didn't even know enough to make his lies plausible. He hadn't just forged my signature. He had built an entire imaginary business on my name, and he was so arrogant, he didn't even bother to do his homework. I took photos of everything, the SBA letters, every single fraudulent invoice. I placed each document back in the box, retaped it, and slid it behind the textbooks, leaving it exactly as I had found it. I walked out of the garage and back into the house, my steps, even my hands, steady. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness. And I had the receipts. The battle wasn't just about saving my house. It was about dismantling his. The lie came on a Wednesday evening, dressed in the clothes of ambition and progress. David came home earlier than usual, a rare event, and he was carrying a blueprint tube under his arm. He exuded an energy I hadn't seen in him since he was a teenager, trying to convince me to let him borrow the car for a weekend trip. He unrolled the blueprint across the dining room table, his hands moving with a practiced theatrical flair. Jessica appeared at his side as if on cue, her expression a perfect blend of admiration and excitement. "Dad, you've got to see this," David said, his voice buzzing. "This is it. The real one. The project that's going to change everything." I walked over, playing my part. I leaned in, squinting a little, the befuddled old man trying to keep up. The blueprint was impressive, full of complex diagrams, technical specifications, and renderings of a sleek, metallic device. It was titled Helios Power Converter. "It's green tech, Dad," he explained, tapping a diagram. "It converts ambient heat into usable electricity with almost 90% efficiency. It's a game changer. We've been working on the prototype in the workshop." I nodded slowly, my mind flashing back to the cheap, disconnected wires and dummy components I'd seen in his rented workshop. The prototype was a stage prop. This blueprint was its script. "Sounds impressive," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Impressive doesn't even cover it," Jessica chimed in, placing a hand on David's arm. "We have a pitch scheduled with a major private equity firm in 3 weeks. They're ready to invest millions, millions." David let that word hang in the air before closing in. "There's just one small hurdle, Dad. The final stage of the prototype requires a specific custom-built component. It's expensive, and we need to order it now to get it in time for the pitch. We're just a little short on liquid capital until the first funding round closes." I waited, knowing the number was coming. I could feel it coiled behind his teeth. "We need $50,000, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a register of earnest sincerity. He looked me straight in the eye, a son appealing to his father. "It's the last piece of the puzzle. This is our life-changing opportunity. This is the one. Mom always believed I could do something big." He invoked Claire's name. The casual cruelty of it almost made me flinch. He was using her memory as leverage to fund a lie. I looked at his face, so full of manufactured hope, and I saw the fraudulent invoices, the hidden SBA letters, the lavish credit card bills. I saw the man who had stolen my name and was now trying to steal my wife's legacy too. For years, this would have been the moment I opened my checkbook. The moment my love for him and my memory of her overrode all common sense. They were counting on it. I could see it in the way Jessica held her breath, in the way David's smile was poised, ready to break into relief. But I was no longer that man. I took a slow breath and let it out. I straightened up and looked from the blueprint to his hopeful face. "That sounds wonderful, son. Truly." I let him feel the warmth of the words for a half-second before I continued. "But 50,000 is a lot of money. I'm not as liquid as I used to be. Things are tighter these days." I gave a small, weary shrug, the kind of gesture a man my age is expected to make. "I'll need to review my finances. Talk to my accountant. Let me look at the numbers and get back to you." The change in the room was immediate. It was as if I'd flipped a switch, cutting the power to their performance. David's smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. The hopeful light in his eyes flickered out, replaced by a flash of confusion, then sharp irritation. "Review," he said, his voice losing its smooth pitch. "Dad, there's no time to review. This is a time-sensitive opportunity. The manufacturer needs the order by Friday, or we lose our slot. The investors won't wait." "Then they won't wait," I said simply. "I can't just write a check for that amount without doing my due diligence. That wouldn't be responsible." He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time in days. He wasn't seeing a forgetful old man. He was seeing a locked door where there had always been an open one. The suspicion crept into his eyes, a dark, searching look. Something was wrong. His safety net had just refused to catch him, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he had no idea why. The week after my refusal was a masterclass in passive aggression. The air in the house grew thick with a cold, manufactured politeness. Jessica would ask if I needed anything in a voice so sweet, it sounded like a threat. David stopped speaking to me altogether, communicating only through sighs and the sharp, deliberate click of his laptop closing whenever I entered a room. They were punishing me with silence, assuming that a lonely old man would eventually break, that I would trade my dignity for a seat back at their table. They didn't understand. I had eaten alone for years. I had learned to find nourishment in the quiet. The call from Ben came on a Tuesday morning while I was in the workshop, cleaning the rust from a set of old pliers. It was the kind of small, satisfying work that calms the mind. "Art, I've got something." Ben's voice was sharp-focused. "I did a deep dive on public filings for Coleman Innovations. Your son's a sloppy bookkeeper, but he's an even sloppier event planner. What did you find? He's not just pitching to some vague investors, Art. He's presenting at the annual Ohio Tech Forward Symposium. It's a major event. He's the keynote speaker for the Emerging Technologies Breakfast. It's in 2 weeks, at the downtown Hilton." I set the pliers down, my hand suddenly still. The downtown Hilton. It wasn't some backroom deal. It was a main stage. David wasn't just building a lie. He was planning to unveil it under a spotlight. "That's his stage, Ben," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "It has been agreed. And a man who builds a stage that big is counting on the audience, not checking the foundation." That night, in a move of calculated arrogance, David left the blueprints for the Helios power converter unrolled on the dining room table. It was a deliberate act, a piece of theater meant for me. He walked by as I was clearing my dinner plate. "Just making some final tweaks for the big pitch, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "It's a shame you're not going to be part of this. It's going to be historic." I said nothing. I just nodded and watched him walk away. After he and Jessica had gone to their room, I went to the table. The fluorescent kitchen light cast a sterile glare on the crisp blue paper. I leaned over it. My hands, which had spent a lifetime reading the honest language of schematics, began to trace the lines of his fiction. Anyone else would have been impressed. The renderings were sleek. The labels were professional. But I wasn't anyone else. I was a master electrician who had spent 40 years diagnosing the difference between a sound circuit and a beautiful lie. And this was the most beautiful lie I had ever seen. My eyes scanned the technical specifications first. He was claiming the device could pull 5,000 watts from an ambient heat differential of just 10 degrees Celsius. I felt a humorless laugh bubble in my chest. David hadn't just bent the rules of physics, he'd thrown the entire book into a furnace. It was a direct violation of the second law of thermodynamics. It was the scientific equivalent of promising to build a staircase to the moon using plywood and hope. Then I looked at the circuit diagrams. My breath caught. It wasn't just flawed, it was a theatrical joke. He'd drawn a primary power conduit that fed into a feedback loop. If this device were ever actually connected to a power source, it wouldn't convert energy. It would create a dead short, melting the main circuit board into a puddle of toxic slag within seconds. It was a self-destruct mechanism disguised as innovation. Finally, I scanned the bill of materials. The components he'd listed, the ones that supposedly cost $50,000, were all consumer-grade parts, dressed up with fancy names. The plasma injector had the part number of a standard industrial capacitor. The photonic resonance chamber was a high-end LED array, the kind used in stage lighting. He was building a very expensive, very convincing light show. I stepped back from the table, my heart a slow, heavy drum. This wasn't the work of an overly optimistic dreamer. This was the work of a con man. The prototype wasn't designed to fail. It was designed to never even try. It was built to look good on a stage, to dazzle men with money, to secure a multi-million-dollar investment, and then to disappear into a labyrinth of excuses and shell corporations. My objective suddenly shifted. This was no longer just about defending myself from the SBA, about saving my house. This was about stopping my son from committing a crime that would ruin the lives of others. Ben had found the stage. David, in his monumental arrogance, had just handed me the script. And I, the man they thought was too old and too confused to matter, was the only one in the world who knew how to read it. The blueprints were a map of my son's deceit. Now I needed a photograph of the territory itself. An idea, cold and clear, began to form. David and Jessica saw me as a relic, a piece of furniture from a past they were trying to renovate. It was time to use that perception as a tool. It was time to become the man they already thought I was. The next afternoon, I put on my oldest cardigan, the one with a faint coffee stain on the cuff that I could never quite get out. I made 2 thick turkey sandwiches on wheat bread, wrapped them in wax paper, and placed them in a brown paper bag, just like Claire used to do for my lunches. I drove my old, reliable sedan, not with the steady confidence of a man on a mission, but with the slightly hesitant, jerky movements of an elderly driver who isn't quite sure of his route. David's workshop was in a soulless industrial park on the other side of town, a place of corrugated metal walls and anonymous roll-up doors. I found the right unit number and parked. I walked to the door carrying the lunch bag and practiced a look of mild paternal confusion. I knocked. After a moment, the door slid open a few feet. David stood there silhouetted against the dim light, his face a mask of annoyance. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I was just in the neighborhood," I said, my voice a little weaker than usual, a carefully crafted performance. "And I got to worrying. With this big presentation coming up, I just wanted to make sure you were eating properly. You always forget to eat when you're stressed." His irritation softened, replaced by a familiar patronizing condescension. He thought I was doting on him. He thought it was cute. "Dad, I'm fine. I was about to order something." "Nonsense," I said, pushing the bag into his hands. "Real food. Your mother would have insisted." He took the bag, a flicker of something, maybe an old memory, maybe just impatience crossing his face. He sighed. "All right, thanks. But I'm really busy. I'll only stay a minute," I said, peering past him into the workshop. "I just want to see this world-changing machine of yours." You make it sound so grand." He hesitated, then shrugged, stepping aside. His arrogance won. He was sure I wouldn't understand a thing I was looking at. "Fine. Come on in. But don't touch anything." The workshop was sparse and dusty. A few workbenches, some scattered tools, and in the center of the room, under a single harsh fluorescent light, was the Helios power converter. I had to admit it was an impressive shell. The aluminum case was professionally milled and polished with sleek lines and an array of impressive-looking but completely non-functional ports and heat sinks. It looked expensive. It looked real. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. "Wow," I said, letting my voice fill with manufactured awe. "It certainly looks the part, son. It does more than look the part, Dad," he said, his ego puffing up. He walked over and patted its side. "This is the future." Just then, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. "It's one of the investors. I have to take this." He turned his back to me, walking toward the far corner of the workshop, for privacy, his voice dropping into the smooth, confident cadence of a salesman. This was my chance. I ambled over to the prototype, still playing the part of a curious old man. I peered at the back panel, which he'd left slightly ajar. My heart was beating a steady, cold rhythm. Inside it was exactly the catastrophe the blueprints had promised. A rat's nest of consumer-grade wires held in place with plastic zip ties, and in one corner a glob of hot glue. The so-called photonic resonance chamber was just a strip of cheap blue LED lights, the kind you'd put under a car. It was a joke. A $500,000 joke. I pulled out my phone, my hands fumbling with it deliberately. I squinted at the screen, making a show of being confused by the technology. David was still deep in his call, pacing, using words like synergy and market disruption. I angled the phone down my thumb, hovering over the camera icon. My hands were shaking now, but not from age. With my body shielding the phone, I quickly snapped 3 pictures. Click. Click, click. The sound was lost in the echo of the large room. The shoddy wiring, the hot glue, the cheap LED strip. I had it. I had the proof. I slipped the phone back into my pocket just as David ended his call. He turned back to me, energized and expansive. "Sorry about that, Dad. Big things are happening." "That's wonderful, son," I said, my smile feeling less like a lie and more like a strategy. "Well, I'll let you get back to it. Don't work too hard. Remember to get some rest." He walked me to the door, clapping me on the shoulder. "Thanks for the lunch, Dad. I'll eat it later." As the workshop door slid shut behind me, I walked back to my car, my steps even and unhurried. He thought he had just entertained a forgetful old man. He had no idea he'd just handed a master electrician all the evidence he needed to dismantle his entire world. The threat did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came on a Thursday afternoon, carried in a designer handbag and wearing a polite, concerned smile. I was in the living room, reading a book on historical shipwrecks, a quiet pleasure I'd rediscovered in the empty hours of the day. The house was still. David was at his workshop, and I thought I was alone. Then I heard the soft click of Jessica's heels on the hardwood floor. I looked up. She was standing in the archway, dressed in an elegant cream-colored pantsuit, her hair perfectly styled. She wasn't dressed for an afternoon at home. She was dressed for a board meeting. "Art," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "I was hoping I could have a word with you." I closed my book, keeping my finger on the page. "Of course, Jessica. Is everything all right?" She didn't sit. She preferred to stand a subtle power play. I had seen her use in rooms far more intimidating than this one. She drifted over to the mantelpiece, running a finger along the wood, checking for dust that wasn't there. "I'm worried about you," she began, her tone a careful performance of compassion. "You've seemed preoccupied lately, a little distant." "Just a lot on my mind," I said, keeping my own voice mild. I understand, she said. And that's what I wanted to talk about. David is under an immense amount of pressure right now. You know how important this Helios pitch is. It's everything to us. It represents years of his hard work finally paying off. I thought of the hot-glued wires and the fraudulent invoices. I thought of the $50,000 she and David had tried to extract from me just last week. I know he's working hard, I said. She turned to face me, then her eyes losing their feigned warmth and taking on a colder, sharper focus. He is, which is why it would be a terrible shame if anything happened to distract him right now. Any family complications, unnecessary drama. She took a step closer, her voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more menacing. You know, Art, at your age, stress can be very dangerous. It's not good for your heart, for your memory. We wouldn't want you to overexert yourself to get worked up over things you might be misunderstanding. There it was. It wasn't a sledgehammer. It was a surgeon's scalpel aimed precisely at the fears she assumed I held. You're old. You're confused. You're frail. If you make trouble for us, we will use your age against you. We will paint you as incompetent. It was the most sophisticated threat I had ever received, wrapped in the silken ribbon of concern for my health. I looked at her, this woman my son had married, and I felt a profound, chilling clarity. She wasn't just an enabler. She was an architect. I could see her hand in David's growing cruelty, in his entitled disregard for me. This was her strategy. For a moment, the old Art, the man who had spent years absorbing slights to keep the peace, wanted to rise up in anger, to tell her exactly what I knew, to show her the pictures on my phone. But Ben's voice echoed in my head. Don't let them know you know anything. So I did the last thing she expected. I gave her the man she thought she was talking to. I let out a slow, weary sigh and sagged a little in my chair. I ran a hand over my face. You're right, Jessica. I said, my voice sounding tired even to my own ears. You're absolutely right. I haven't been sleeping well. My mind, it does wander these days. The last thing I would want is to be a distraction for David. Not now. I looked up at her and gave her a faint, grateful smile. Thank you for your concern. It means a lot. I think I will make an effort to rest more. Perhaps you're right. I should just leave the complicated things to you and David. Her expression flickered. It was a brief, almost imperceptible shift, but I saw it. Confusion. She had come prepared for a fight, for an emotional outburst she could later describe as one of my episodes. She hadn't come prepared for my complete and total agreement. My surrender robbed her of her victory. Exactly, she said finally, her voice a little too bright. We just want what's best for you, Art. I know you do, I said. She stood there for a moment longer, a queen whose checkmate had been met with a polite yawn. Then, with a final brittle smile, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking out a rhythm of frustrated efficiency. I watched her go, and when she was gone, I picked my book back up. My hands were perfectly steady. She thought she had just put me in my place. She had no idea she had just confirmed my next move. The boardroom at Sterling Private Equity was a cathedral of modern capitalism. It was on the 40th floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic, almost arrogant view of the city below. A single massive mahogany table polished to a mirror, shine dominated the room. Around it sat a dozen men and women in tailored suits, their faces impassive, their attention focused on the man standing at the head of the table. My son, David. He was in his element. He moved with a liquid confidence, his voice smooth and persuasive, as he painted a picture of a future powered by his revolutionary device. The Helios power converter sat on a custom-built pedestal behind him, its polished aluminum shell gleaming under the recessed lighting. It looked like something beamed in from a distant, more intelligent future. It looked like $5 million. And so, with a 90% efficiency rate in converting ambient heat to electrical energy, David said, his hands gesturing toward the device, the Helios is not just an innovation. It is a paradigm shift. It is the end of energy scarcity as we know it. He was brilliant. He was charming. He was a liar. I had spent the last week confirming every detail. Ben had secured the full pitch deck through a discovery request related to the SBA case. I had spent hours going over it, marking up the fraudulent technical specs with a red pen, just as I had marked up his failing geometry homework 25 years ago. The lies were the same, just with more zeros attached. I had arrived at the Hilton 15 minutes early, wearing the best suit I owned, a simple navy wool clean, and pressed, but a world away from the bespoke armor worn by the men in that room. I hadn't gone to the 40th floor. I'd taken the elevator to the 39th, to a small janitorial closet Ben had found on the building's schematic. I stood there in the dark, the smell of industrial cleaner in the air, and I waited. At the exact moment David was scheduled to begin his closing remarks, I stepped out of the closet and took the service stairs up one flight. I pushed open the heavy fire door and stepped into the hushed, carpeted hallway outside the boardroom. I could hear the murmur of his voice, confident and clear. I put my hand on the heavy oak door, took one slow breath, and walked in. The room didn't notice me at first. All eyes were on David. Then a junior analyst at the far end of the table looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. An old man in an ill-fitting suit didn't belong here. His gaze caused another to look, and then another, a silent ripple that finally reached the head of the table. David's voice faltered mid-sentence. He stopped. His confident smile froze, then melted away, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Jessica, sitting in the front row of spectator chairs, went pale, her hand flying to her throat. They looked at me as if they were seeing a ghost. The lead investor, a formidable-looking man with silver hair named Mr. Harrison, turned in his seat. "Can we help you, sir?" he asked, his voice polite but edged with steel. "Dad." David stammered, taking a step forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Not now. This isn't a good time. We can talk later." I ignored him. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were fixed on Mr. Harrison. I walked slowly, deliberately down the length of the long table, my simple leather shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. I stopped a few feet from him. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice clear and steady. "My apologies for the interruption. My name is Arthur Coleman. I'm a retired master electrician with 40 years of experience in the field." I paused, letting my credentials settle in the room. "Before you and your partners invest $5 million in that device, I wonder if you would permit me to ask just one question about its primary power conduit." A tense silence filled the room. David looked like he was about to be physically ill. Harrison studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp and analytical. He wasn't a man who suffered fools. Then he gave a curt single nod. "Proceed." I turned and walked to the prototype, the beautiful gleaming lie my son had built. I ran my hand over its cool metal surface. "According to the schematics your team was provided," I began, my voice calm, almost conversational. "This device is designed to handle an enormous energy load. But the gauge of this external wiring," I pointed to a thick, impressive-looking cable, "is insufficient. It's a standard residential-grade wire. Under the load described, it would overheat and melt in under a minute." I then pointed to a component visible through a small glass window. "And that capacitor. It's a fine piece of equipment for a high-end stereo system. It is not, however, an industrial-grade component capable of managing the kind of energy regulation this device claims. It would blow the second you tried to power it on." The room was utterly still. The investors were leaning forward, their polite masks replaced by expressions of intense scrutiny. "But the real issue," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket, "is this." I pulled out the simple $20 multimeter I'd brought from my workshop. It was old, a little scuffed, but it had never lied to me. This device is supposedly active, converting the heat in this very room into power as we speak. I switched the multimeter on and touched the two probes to the main output terminals. The digital display glowed to life. It read 0. A perfect, beautiful, damning 0. This device isn't drawing any power, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Because it isn't connected to anything. This isn't the future of energy, gentlemen. I looked from the investors to Jessica, and finally to my son, who stood frozen in a state of pure horror. It's just a beautifully painted box. Then for the final act, I pulled a simple Phillips head screwdriver from my other pocket. I knelt down, located the 4 screws on a side access panel, the one labeled diagnostic port, and with 4 quick practice turns, I loosened them. I lifted the panel away, and I showed them the inside. It was empty. Not a single circuit board, not a single processor. Just a hollow shell with the cheap blue LED light strip I had seen in the workshop, and a mess of disconnected, sloppy wires hot glued to the interior walls to create the illusion of complexity. A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was unanimous. The lie was not just exposed, it had been physically dismantled. Mr. Harrison stood up. He didn't look at David. He looked at me. Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice flat and cold. Thank you for your time. You've saved us a great deal more. He turned to his associates. We're done here. Without another word, they began to gather their things, their movements swift and silent. The $5 million deal didn't just die. It evaporated as if it had never existed. David didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the hollow shell of his ambition, the beautiful painted box that had cost him everything. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the last investor, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, a void, where millions of dollars and a lifetime of ambition had just been. David stood frozen beside his hollow creation, his face a canvas of disbelief. The charismatic, confident salesman had vanished, leaving behind a pale, stunned man who looked as though he'd just watched his own ghost walk out of the room. Jessica had sunk into one of the plush spectator chairs, her hands gripping the armrests, her knuckles white. Her perfect polished mask had finally cracked, revealing the raw panic underneath. She stared at the empty prototype, the beautifully painted box, as if it had personally betrayed her. I remained by the head of the table, my simple screwdriver still in my hand. The weight of it felt immense. I had come here to stop a lie, but in doing so, I had brought down my own son. There was no triumph in it, only a profound, hollow ache. I looked at David, at the boy I had taught to ride a bike and bait a hook, now a man drowning in the consequences of his own choices. The main door to the boardroom opened again, this time without a knock. Ben Carter stepped in first, his expression grim and resolute. He was flanked by 2 other people, a man and a woman, dressed in the understated, serious suits of federal investigators. They moved with a quiet efficiency that made the air in the room feel even heavier. David Coleman, Ben said, his voice calm and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of the law, not the voice of a man who had known this family for decades. These are special agents from the Office of the Inspector General. They are here regarding the defaulted $500,000 SBA loan guaranteed by your father. David flinched as if he'd been struck. His eyes darted from the agents to Ben, and then finally to me. The disbelief in his face curdled into a look of raw, accusatory betrayal. You, he whispered the word barely audible. You did this. No, son, I said, my voice thick with a sorrow he couldn't possibly understand. You did. The female agent stepped forward, her gaze sweeping from the hollow prototype to the scattered pitch documents on the table. Mr. Coleman, she said to David, it seems the pattern of fraudulent representation we've been investigating is not a new one. The evidence gathered from today's demonstration, combined with the fraudulent invoices and the forged loan guarantee, is substantial. That was when David finally broke. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was a quiet, complete collapse. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped his lips. His knees seemed to give way, and he sank into the nearest leather chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. All the performance, all the bravado, all the years of effortless charm, dissolved in an instant, leaving only a terrified, broken man. Jessica stared, her mouth slightly agape. Her mind, always 3 steps ahead, was racing, searching for an angle, an exit strategy, a way to spin this. But there was no exit. The walls had closed in. She looked at me, her eyes blazing with a pure, undiluted hatred. If looks could kill, I would have been a dead man. She had lost everything, and in her mind I was the one who had taken it. The male agent approached David. "David Coleman, you are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." He spoke the words professionally, without malice, which somehow made them more terrible. He gently took David's arm. David didn't resist. He was limp, a puppet with its strings cut. The agent recited his rights, the familiar words echoing strangely in the opulent boardroom. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was a sharp, metallic finality in the quiet room. It was the sound of a future ending. They led him toward the door, a dazed, shuffling figure who didn't seem to recognize the room he was leaving. The female agent then turned to Jessica. "Jessica Coleman, you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Jessica didn't cry or scream. She simply went rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. She stood, allowing the agent to handcuff her, her movements stiff and mechanical. As they led her past me, she stopped. "I will burn you to the ground for this art," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You will have nothing left." I met her gaze. "You already tried to take everything, Jessica," I said quietly. "There's nothing left for you to burn." They were led out of the boardroom, past the gleaming mahogany table, past the panoramic view of the city, and past the hollow metal box that was the tombstone of their ambition. The terrible secret truth I had learned on the phone in my quiet hallway had finally become their loud, inescapable public reality. When they were gone, Ben walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. The room was silent again, littered with the debris of a fallen empire, a scattered blueprint, an abandoned laptop, a single forgotten glass of water. "It's over, Art," Ben said softly. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the view outside the window. The city bustled below, a world of people living their lives completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded 40 floors above them. I had won. I had saved my home. I had stopped my son from hurting anyone else. But as I stood there watching the distant traffic flow like blood through the city's veins, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral. 3 months later, the autumn sun slanted through the dusty windows of my workshop, illuminating the slow, deliberate dance of sawdust in the air. The legal battles were over. The headlines had faded. My name was my own again, and the house, the quiet sanctuary Claire and I had built, was safe. The world had returned to its proper rhythm. I spent my days here among the familiar smells of pine and oil, my hands finding their old, steady purpose in the grain of the wood. The work was simple, restoring an old rocking chair, building a small bookshelf, but it was honest. It was the opposite of a beautifully painted box. The mailman left a small stack on the porch, and among the bills and catalogs was a plain white envelope with a postmark from a federal correctional facility. David's handwriting, smaller and more cramped than I remembered, was on the front. I carried it into the workshop and set it on my bench next to a piece of oak I had been sanding. For a long time I just looked at it, the coffee in my mug growing cold. Finally, I slid it open. The letter wasn't long. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame Jessica or the investors or the market. He wrote about the silence of his cell, how the quiet for the first time in his life was absolute. He wrote about how in that silence he had finally been forced to meet the man he had become, and he was ashamed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. The letter was a confession, not a petition. He wrote that he finally understood that the most expensive thing he had ever spent wasn't the government's money, but my trust. I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it carefully on the workbench. I walked to the window and looked out at the small garden Claire had planted by the back steps. The last of her late-blooming roses were holding on their crimson petals a defiant splash against the fading green. I didn't feel the sharp, satisfying sting of victory. There was no triumph, no sense of vindication. What I felt instead was a deep, somber peace, a quiet, heavy sense of an ending. A story had been told, a terrible price had been paid, and now at last it was over. The ache for the son I had lost was still there, a ghost limb that would likely ache for the rest of my days. But the anger was gone. The fear was gone. The crushing weight of his betrayal had been lifted. I turned back to my workbench. I picked up the letter, slid it into the cherry wood box that held the restored tools, and closed the lid. It belonged there with the other things from the past that needed to be put away with care. Then I picked up the smooth, unfinished piece of oak. I measured the wood, drew a clean pencil line, and switched on the bandsaw. The machine whirred to life, its sound clean and purposeful in the quiet afternoon. My life had been returned to me, and I would use it to build. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that sometimes the greatest act of love is to stop saving someone from the consequences of their own actions. True support isn't about providing an endless safety net, but about having the courage to let someone you care about finally feel their own weight so they can learn to stand on their own. What did you think of Arthur's final decision? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of quiet strength and setting boundaries, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that matter.